Thanks very much, and thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk about my passions, twin passions of course, geological viewpoints and military history. So combining those two has been a success for me as far as I'm concerned. So really what I want to do today is to talk to you a little bit about Flanders and Gallipoli, and to take out from that specific issues that I am interested in, that we perhaps should have been considering in any kind of battleground. Now this is something that I've been working on for some time. This is a one of those rather expensive academic books which came from a conference in the year 2000 and came out of a research grant with the Leader Hume Trust, which I was pleased to get on this very subject. So really it was all about how does terrain in warfare work? What's it all about? How did it have an impact? Lots and lots of books about the Great War, about military history in general, will refer to terrain but may not necessarily understand what's going on at that ground point or even below ground. So I want to try and discuss with you what challenges terrain place and present in any kind of battlefront. I want to look particularly at the development of trench warfare, and the speakers this morning set up some fantastic questions that we can draw upon here. How did trench warfare come about? What was it like to prosecute that? And really what I want to do then is to take you in and look at aspects of the military geography of both Gallipoli and Flanders. Now that's incredibly difficult to try and do a direct comparison, as any geographer will tell you. That was specifically for you, sir. So the reality of this then is I'm going to try and draw some kind of aspects from this that allow you maybe to look at these campaigns in a completely different light, I hope. So let's just look at it from a geographic perspective, okay? I'm thinking about 1915, Battlefront Europe. So these are from some military maps that were produced for the general public by the Germans. They were for sale on every newsstand weekly, and it went on into 1919. They told the story absolutely. And we can see here the varied landscape that you would imagine across the Western Front. But we're also considering, remember, the Eastern Front, something that we probably don't even think about. The broad expanse of the steppes from the Masurian lakes down to the Carpathian Mountains, incredibly mixed in terms of the terrain there. And then in 1915 we're starting to see the Alpine warfare. I mean, this is incredible when you look at what was being fought between the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians, the reality of exploding the tops off mountains and tunneling into glaciers, something which is an incredible part of history of the First World War that's probably not really considered by us over here in Britain. And we also see developing other theatres. Let's not forget Salonika, like everybody forgets Salonika. Salonika is incredible when you go and look at the landscape and you look at the fortress that was made out of those mountains and the multinational forces that were facing the Bulgarians. Let's not also forget that the Bulgarians were the first of the Central Powers to actually be defeated in this difficult terrain. So yeah, we also look at the kinds of things that were going to be happening fighting the Ottomans on other ground than Gallipoli, in Sinai, in the Arabian Peninsula, and in other parts in Palestine and so on. These are complex terrain elements which I, again, haven't got a huge amount of time to talk about, but the Middle East showing just how varied and mixed the British experience had to be of fighting on a wide variety of fronts and geographies. So the military geography of the war gets more complex the more the war develops. So let's start with the ground. What is terrain? Terrain is a foundation of all military operations. Every battle is fought on some form of terrain or other. And that is a combination, in very simple terms, of what was going on the rocks beneath the feet, the climate, the weathering, the erosional facilities that are going on to develop, the features here like we see with Walker's Ridge, the Sphinx, Pluggy's Plateau and so on. We also have to look at the impact of vegetation and human influences, and these are just some of the aspects that terrain has to play here. And so we are comparing, if you like, the differences between landscape development in an environment which is quite green and wet, like in Flanders, or in areas which is completely arid in some parts, lush in others, as we see in Gallipoli. So terrain, the foundation of all military campaigns. Now you can make some kind of trite comparison with some of the great thinkers of the military, and we only have to look at Sun Tzu. We could get Clausewitz in here if we really wanted to. The reality of this is that the contour of the land is an aid to the army. Obviously, sizing this up, seeing how landscape, how terrain is going to play out really is an important part of any military campaign, because those who do not do this are seeking to fail. Now we could argue, we could ask questions, was that the case, both in Flanders in 1915 and in Gallipoli in 1915? So we need to think about the idea of terrain appreciation, the idea of developing intelligence. And this, reputedly, the first trench map developed from aerial photographic reconnaissance. By 1918, of course, we are looking at incredible complexity and sophistication. But in 1915, we're looking at something a little bit more basic. So we're thinking about strategic and tactical reconnaissance in all cases. We're thinking about the use of existing maps, and in Flanders, well, there are plenty of them, but less so on the ground in Gallipoli. And the ill-fated map that everybody blames in Gallipoli, well, that was the map that was available. We also have to think about how aerial photographic reconnaissance developed. And it's all very well to say, well, you know, there was not enough intelligence in the Gallipoli campaign. We have to think about what's possible. And then, of course, there's the capability to do raids, trench raids, examining the ground conditions and landings. And if I tell you that in 1917 British soldiers were sent over the top with hammers in order to take samples of German pillboxes to be analysed in the British Geological Survey, can you imagine what it was like to be one of those soldiers with a little hammer? So these things are significant parts of our understanding of any kind of campaign. Look at D-Day. That's what it's all about. All of them help to build up a picture of the battlefront. So, field service regulations, we've heard a lot about, and quite rightly so. Directing the British Army in their perspective, part authored, directed, engaged by Haig. Timely information regarding the enemy's dispositions, the topographical features, etc., essential in war. So you can see where this is going, can't you? You can see how this is going to lead up to this point, where in Gallipoli, terrain intelligence is completely lacking. Those were inverted commas, by the way, inverted commas. This was from an American comic book, which is fantastic. We're in luck, oh boy, this map of Gallipoli is only 100 years old, it can't have changed. It's completely mythologized. Is it real? Well, obviously what we can see from Hamilton's perspective, Hamilton writing up his diary, again in inverted commas, that yes, there was 10-year-long years of the existence of the General Staff, but was there any plans of an attack on Constantinople? No, of course there wasn't. The Dardanelles and the Bosphorus may well be on the move. Well, I'm sorry, that's not true. It's very simple. The map was the best that was available. If we want to be very direct about this, you have to actually understand how the map works. The purpose of the map. The map has everything on it, believe it or not. Okay? There are some things where it's over-interpreted, but the map has the contour lines, it has the spot heights, it has the details. You just need to learn how to read this map. And also, Hamilton's perspective that he had hardly any briefing. Well, he had the Manual of Combined Naval and Military Operations, which we heard about this morning from Eric Grove. They had the reports of all of this material, the aspects of all of these. Caldwell was involved in these. Do you think that Caldwell, the librarian of the War Office, is not going to deliver these to Hamilton? I think not. Mind you, we have to take that warning that Amy pointed out. Just because you have them doesn't mean you use them. But he certainly had these. And there were, of course, the NID report in 1908 of the Turkish coastal defences. So it's very easy for us, with 2020 hindsight, to look back on these kind of campaigns and say there were no plans, there was no information. I think the more pertinent point here is the commander deciding to use those, not necessarily that they don't exist. Okay, so I just wanted to bring to your attention then some of the aspects of assimilation of information on terrain. And one of those is something which is of great tactical importance, and that is the use of geology in warfare. Military commanders should incorporate geological information, etc. This is from US military doctrine in the 1950s. Maybe not necessarily so from the British, but certainly the British relearned some of this information. Why does that matter to us? Well, it matters because the geology and the terrain elements define vantage, the opportunity to observe your enemy and to be concealed from the enemy. Otherwise, why would you have trenches in the first place? There's the question of movement and trafficability. If we want to examine these kind of concepts, then we can look at any of the Second World War battles, at Ypres, for example, an amphibious battle, if we want to look at Normandy. All of these things are really important in planning those campaigns. We also have, with the onset of trench warfare and the sort of idea that trench warfare was predestined, which again Amy was referring to. If you're going to have trench warfare, you need to have civil engineering, military engineering. You need to understand what's going to happen, and these A-frames from 1917 show how the military geologists worked with the military engineers in order to ensure there were solutions. And then there are resource provisions. Once a campaign is in play, you need to resource your armies. And at Gallipoli, as we know, the major resource problems is going to be water and water supply. Now, I can give you chapter and verse on that. I'm not going to. We're going to concentrate on other aspects of the Gallipoli campaign. But needless to say, this is one of the wells, Joe Murray's well here at Gully Beach. So all of those things to be considered. So I want to take you first to the Western Front and then to Gallipoli. I'm going to look at aspects of terrain. I'm not going to take through and consider every aspect. I'm going to pick out some of the things that show how these factors had a role to play during the war. So we're looking on the Western Front of quite a large terrain types being crossed here by these trench lines. So from the British perspective of Ypres and Somme and Artois, and then of course on the Champagne, which is an amazing landscape, and down into the Vosges, we can see a wide range of terrain types that's going to define how these battles are being fought. We, in our narrow focus, are concentrating on Flanders and Artois many times. So it's this static warfare that was evolving and evolved, dictated by the tactics and the weapons, required this terrain appreciation, this idea that you need to understand every contour for it to really work. So sophistication became the name of the game by the end of the war, less so in the early part. I'm trying to avoid that word learning curve, but anyway, you understand what I'm talking about. So, the Western Front then, in our northern perspective, this is rather a lurid geological map. And the geological map simply shows you what is found at the surface and how that controls what's going on at the surface and below that surface. So my green here is bounded by the coastal plains of dunes and polders. Those are very important and significant actually in this idea about the possibility of amphibious landing on the Belgian coast and crossing the sand dunes with tanks was something that had to be considered. So we're also looking at the clay plain of Flanders, the wet, liable to pond surface water. I can't tell you how many times I have read using a word nonsense about this landscape. You know, it was once a swamp. It was not a swamp. It's never been a swamp. So let's just get that straight. We also look at the chalk upland of Artois and Picardy. Dry chalks, which are actually difficult to get water from, very challenging. So those things are going to affect your combat capability in those areas. So the dunes, well, you could dig into those. The polders, you could flood those. The clay plain, obviously you need to combat the possibility that you're going to end up with something that observes a swamp. And the sand ridges, all about the idea of vantage, looking down here into the area. This is Passchendaele before and after being destroyed. The vantage, getting the opportunity to see and observe your enemy. So let's take a few of those concepts and look at them in a bit more detail. So the Ypres salient continues to fascinate me. The idea that the sand ridges, in inverted commas, surround the town/city of Ypres. If we look at the work that was done by the military geographers and geologists of the day, we can see just how that was developed. We can see here the blue clay, as it's so called, with these ridges sitting on top. That had an unfortunate effect on the Germans, who were sitting in the high ground. The terrain advantage that they had meant that their ground was incredibly waterlogged. That's why they had to build pillboxes. Down here in the clay plain, it may be difficult to drain, but the opportunity to dig tunnels was absolute. Why do you think we've got one of the best underground systems, or tunnels anyway, set of tunnels in London? Same clay, same situation, best ground to dig in. So we're looking at an interesting set of terrain characteristics, and then we look at the development of how trench warfare is going to fit into that terrain. So we know what French trenches were like in the early part of the war. That photograph there shows again a similar kind of situation of British trenches, showing once again the poverty of design at the early part of the war. By the end, we can see just how much more engineered those trenches are, and that required an awful lot of terrain intelligence. So most of you have been here, you've probably walked those and bemused looked at them, but in reality we are looking at something which is very close to the earth here in Hill 62, and very similar to perhaps the simplicity of some of the earlier trench designs compared again to these archaeological digs showing some of the more complex trenches. So the British Army and the training of British officers required some kind of idea of terrain analysis. Hence, we can see here the Defence of Duffus Drift, one of those classic books of the time. We can see again that the field service regulations are very clear about the idea of vantage and the business about keeping the defence economical so that you can expand on the offence. Clearly, the influence of ground was such that it was easier to defend in some cases, and it meant therefore that it was very much more difficult to have an offensive, again, from the field service regulations. So if we look once again at the superiority of German vantage, the Germans had invaded Belgium and had taken up their positions in the best possible places. Why wouldn't you do that? And so we can see here the German vantage. Yes, there's actually some difficulties in taking that vantage point because the ground itself is quite wet. Those sand ridges, for a variety of technical reasons, are very difficult. The British movements are therefore always under observation, variable ground conditions causing some problems. Now if you look at the textbooks of the time and the papers, this was a technical paper written about trench warfare, we can see just how significant it was to ensure that your trench lines provide maximum enfilade capabilities here. So if you have a valley or a spur, like this one, a valley, you can see that trying to storm up the valley meant that you were going to be open to enfilade fire. Equally, if you were on a spur, setting back the trench lines would give you the opportunity of providing enfilade fire to the attacking forces. This was, again, a written, idealised doctrine. And then we look at things like this, which are actually going against that grain, but are simply there to break up any kind of attack. So like the Hohenzollern Redoubt here at Lewis, and we can see that the redoubt sticking forward pugnaciously is there to break up any form of British or French advance, to expend, allow those men to expend their energy on such a redoubt. Now that grant that I talked to you about in Messines, looked at Messines, showed just how sophisticated the development of trench warfare in the defensive form was. This is Haig's assessment of Lewis, and if we look elsewhere, this was some work I did using trench maps and digital terrain models and all kinds of technical wizardry. If we look at it in a very simple form, this is strength in depth. The ridge crest providing the maximum vantage. The spurs showing strong points. That's why the British combat that with mines. The valleys, again, deflecting the lines so that they follow the contour to provide enfilade fire. The ability to put your guns in the reverse slope, all of them engineered to break up the attack. This was intelligence in defense, providing real difficulty in breaking through, all down to geographic principles. So let's sum up the trench warfare component. The terrain lessons, we can see just how important this is, and even though the field service regulations are saying don't expend too much time on that, don't spend too much effort on that, the Germans were clearly developing that concept, and we're going to see that from the Ottoman perspective as well. The ground conditions perhaps challenging some of the advantages provided, but really we need to ensure that there's a technology and a force of arms that's going to break it, and that comes later in the war. Okay, so let's look at the technology that we've got of breaking the siege. Artillery, mining, gas, tanks. Now I'm going to concentrate only on 1915, so it's those three, mining, artillery and gas, that I'm going to talk about. Now we know, I don't have to go into great depth about this, you're fully conversant with the whole problem about the supply in 1915 of shells, the shrapnel shells, which did their job effectively as an anti-personnel weapon but did not do their job effectively as an anti-fortification weapon. And we know that the shell scandal, as so called, was something which was going to challenge the British in their campaigns in 1915, whether it be in the Western Front or in Gallipoli. Very significant. So we know that at Neuve-Chapelle, almost a victory, and then of course by the time we're in May in Aubert Ridge and Festubert, these are challenging all perceptions. We're not able to bring in the artillery to bear. That's going to play also in Gallipoli. So another opportunity you've got of breaking the siege, latter-day siege weapons, is to bring back something which is medieval in concept, which is, again, mining. And I could do whole talks on mining, I'm not going to. Obviously this is 1916, but the same concept was 1914-15. We can see the advantages of the terrain from the perspective of the British. Okay, the sand ridges on the top there, well, the Germans had to tunnel down through the indifferent wet ground to achieve undermining of the British in the clay. That meant they were completely on the back foot. The British had the capability of just tunneling very shallowly down and underneath the Germans, and were very effective at that. And so we know the Battle of Messines, those strong points that I pointed out to you, that was started in 1915 and came to its fruition in June 1917. Shows you how long it is to actually invest in mine warfare. There are other complex elements to that, like the soils there in the valleys. So if artillery is not going to do the job and mining takes too much to do it, then why not just kill the occupants of the trenches? It's hard, it is difficult. This, of course, is not a photograph of the Western Front, but you get the sense of what's happening here with the cloud gas that is being unleashed in April 1915. Poison gas used for the first time in any great deal, released from the cylinders. It's effective because there's a sloping ground. Basically, the land is sloping down towards the British, and so the prevailing winds were particularly favourable. So we end up with something in the first gas cloud that stoves in the top of the Ypres salient. We know what happened to the troops that had to face this, how difficult that was, challenged by some new technology. And we can see also how the line was eventually held at this greatly reduced salient. It also meant that gas could possibly make up for the inadequacies, but I tell you what is required here, an understanding of how gas is going to operate, not just with the wind conditions, but also with ground conditions. Because the air density is 1.225 kilograms per meter cubed. The chlorine density is 3.04 kilograms per meter cubed, i.e. chlorine is heavier than air. It will sink. We know all of the stories about gas filling up shell holes. So to move it requires gravity of rolling down the slope. and of strong pushing winds to keep it going if that's what you require. So it will remain static, otherwise it's heavier than air. So if we look at Loos, the anniversary of which was just a day or so ago, gentle slopes and industrial clutter, we can see the way in which the Germans have developed their trench warfare. We can see the roads which are crossing this, the red dots or dashes, the British lines, the black ones, the German ones. Again, the dastardly Germans have built into their front line everything that's capable of breaking up the attack. So we can see the double crassier, we can see 2 redoubts on those roads to do exactly what we were talking about, break up any kind of advance. We can see the Tower Bridge and its crassier, and we can see a whole host of other things that the Germans are making the most out of. So from the British perspective, making use of gas here relied upon wind to drive it, and maybe, just maybe, the capability of landscape. Now that landscape is gentle here. Now Haig was fully aware of what it was going to be like. He was commander of the First Army. He knew that the ground was bare and open, had numerous German fortifications that would break up any kind of attack. So rapid advance, that's going to be difficult. So using gas was something that Haig realized could fill in the gap for the artillery. Now it's a complex ground conditions. Quite often, and too often, we move past this as we're driving to the Somme or back from the Somme. But if you spend some time considering it, it's a complex set of ground conditions, very gentle slopes. We can see here the Grenade Spur here. We can see how in part of the line is up. From the British perspective, in part it's down. So we can see the valley where Loos is, the hill behind, of course. So we do have very definitely a valley front here, and we can see just how the gas operated. I've already given a talk on this to the Western Front Association, but we can see how gas remained static, how it moved, and this was in the face of very still conditions in terms of atmospheric winds and other things. So whereas local conditions may have helped drive the gas, it was all down to the opportunity to flow down slopes. So gas, again, if you're going to break those sieges, requires you really understanding what's going to happen on that ground. So let's look at this breaking siege and review some of those aspects from the Western Front. Artillery was challenging because there weren't sufficient artillery pieces or shells. Undermining was fine, but it's labour and time intensive. And cloud gas is a difficult thing to use. Later in the war, as technology developed, it became a more tactical weapon and one which was used to catch people when they didn't have the gas masks on, and artillery pieces and so on. So lots and lots of difficult things in 1915. By the way, I couldn't possibly agree that the use of tanks on the Gallipoli Peninsula would have in any way helped their fortunes, but that's just my view. That's an answer to the question we had earlier. So that was the Western Front. I wanted to just pick out some of the aspects of 1915 on the trench warfare of the Western Front. Let's examine now Gallipoli, and I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the landings. If we take the perspective that once men had got onto the beaches, if they hadn't pushed off those beaches, then the campaign from a military perspective was over. If we take that as a possibility, then the landings are so important. And I want to examine detailed aspects of the Gallipoli campaign from that perspective. So let's look at the Gallipoli campaign from a slightly different perspective, the geographic perspective. And let's look at a Landsat image, which tells you everything. If you're a geographer, or even just wondering why the hell is the peninsula looking like that, you can see the fractures in this, which are all down to the fault lines, which are tectonically active. That's why there are seismic activity there, and still threatening is an earthquake potentially for Çanakkale at some point. So we can see just how offset here the narrows are. That offset here is because there are fractures going across the peninsula and fractures going along the actual channel. So the narrows is no accident. This offsetting and rectilinear form is no accident. This is all down to the tectonic forces, the plates, if you like, that bound the European area and the Asian area. It's titanic in all ways. There's also a very significant fracture that goes right the way through the peninsula. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because it divides up the Anzac sector from the Suvla Bay sector, and that's one of the reasons why Anzac is so tortuous. If we look at it from the perspective of the geology, again, part of the terrain training of our men on the ground would be to examine these kind of things. We can see here that these belts which go across the peninsula give the possibility of rapid deployment of troops across. And the idea here of coming to this location in Gallipoli and going across the peninsula was something that was entertained, but not for long. The upland areas here of the area of Chunuk and the concept of Anzac Cove as it became, this is only where these particular rocks sit out at the landscape here just at Anzac Cove. And we can see how different it is here in Suvla Bay, how wide it is, and we can see this fault fracture. So in essence what I'm saying is that the variety of different landscapes that you see when you go to Gallipoli, that's no accident, and it had a material effect on the outcome of the campaign. So let's look at the challenges of landing at the in April. I'm not going to be dealing with the Suvla Bay campaign. There's too many ifs, whats, buts and maybes. Let's just look at the April landings. So these are the kinds of concepts that were entertained by Hamilton, who thought carefully about where he would land his troops. Now, if you read Liman van Sanders' book, it's complex this, but if we thought about Liman van Sanders being a better author and a worse general, it would be better than what we had, which was a good author and not so good a general, so from the British perspective. But Liman van Sanders' dry account says that reality here is that the places where the British landed were the only places that were really available to them. And I think I agree with that. Now, if we take that as read, then the only places that could be there to support the Navy, this was a naval campaign, let's not forget that. So to support the Navy, the only places you're going to land that are going to mean anything are places where you can observe, as Gary Sheffield pointed out, the narrows and the capability of taking out all of those weapons along the coast. So the command and control issues here are going to be enormous if you're putting men ashore here at Anzac, the tried, untested, raw troops of the AIF, and also the regulars, who I would say were 1st Division, but that's just me, coming ashore here at, at that point. So we can see here, these men are coming ashore and getting up this valley, and that's where they are trying to get in order to take on the Kilib Bahir Plateau and to dominate the narrows behind it. So anyway, here we have Cape Helles, and what we can see from Cape Helles' perspective is just how difficult it was from the terrain perspective issues. We can see what the idea was, that the idea of landing here was simply to allow the Navy to do their job, what they were good at, naval gunnery. Now unfortunately, naval gunnery, of course, was intended to be flat trajectory to take out both ships and also forts, which was originally what the whole campaign was about. So we can see just how significant it would be for those men to come ashore and to be covered by the covering fire of the Navy. Now the terrain issues were paramount here, because we can see as the men are coming ashore at V&W beaches, they're going to have to funnel their way up this open glacis, using an ancient term, the rising ground, to get to Achibaba, Alchitepe at the top here. This slope was something that had to be combated, had to rise the ground, and it was broken up into these rectilinear divisions, the drainage draining right the way down the peninsula. So you have a real difficulty in command and control. Once the men were ashore here, you were at the mercy of what's going to be going on the ground. Now the whole idea was to go to Achibaba to find this dominant obsession of the Allies. We can see that it only provided a relatively limited view of the narrows, although it gave a broader perspective, as we've seen from Gary's talk. I could imagine how this haunted Hamilton, who was used to the flat top years of the South African campaign, seeing this damned flat top hill that figured largely in his campaign plans as the war went on. And we also have, not only do the damned Germans build defensive positions that are going to break up your attack, the Turks, how dare they, were also fortifying their landscape, because if Linman von Sanders knew that those were the best places to land, then he was going to ensure that the same principles were put in place. And so if we look at the assessments of the campaign after the campaign was over, we can see exactly what was happening here. The same principles of trench warfare being applied. We can see the cliff lines here. These cliff lines are providing absolute obstacles. We can see the narrow beaches, which go into slot-like valleys or gorges. Gorges overplaying it, but certainly slot-like valleys. If this doesn't look like Omaha Beach to you, I don't know what Omaha Beach looks like. And the reality is that these men are being held on the beaches by all of the fortifications, enfilade fire, trenches which are following the contour lines, doing everything that Sun Tzu was suggesting. Holding the men on the beach so that they can't invest the landscape inland. We heard that already. That's what you've got to do. You've got to push on off that beach and get inland. So at V and W and X, Y, well, that's another matter I'm not going to go into, or S. But those are the beaches which are the most significant from that perspective. So let's examine V Beach. Yes, we've heard about the River Clyde. Love it or hate it, it was there as a purpose. It was an idea, it has a concept, a landing craft to bring out all of the men. If you've never seen the film Tell England, you should. It's an interesting film, but it has the best battle sequences you're ever going to see when it comes down to the Gallipoli campaign. It was made in the 1920s. So here we can see some of the fortification issues, the earth bank that became so important, the rock spit, which again was going to be something that they're going to connect with. So all of those things are important geographic features that have a role to play in the Gallipoli campaign. Now Hamilton wrote that he felt that just at the last point they were going to get away with it. And that's what many people were saying. Doyle himself felt that also. The reality of the River Clyde, of course, is the men getting ashore, the idea of them pushing ahead, and the idea of them taking on the Ottoman threat. Now they thought they would get away with it, and that's in many of the accounts. You know, we are getting ashore here. It'd be fine because the Ottoman Turks, who are they anyway? What are they going to do? Well, let's just look at the terrain characteristics of this beach. Again, if you've studied, as I've studied, I'm sure many of you have done here in Fort Number 1, you'll get the sense here, you're looking down into this amphitheatral form. We can see set over here, the fort here, and also the way in which the trenches go around and follow the outcrop of rock sticking out the surface. They're not stupid, they're going to fill these with men. We can see here the cemetery in the foreground. Now let's look at what happened. One of the reasons why the Ottoman Turks were holding their fire is because this is getting towards the maximum range of the Mauser in some cases. And it also means that these men are skillful riflemen. They're not just some backwoodsmen. They are actually understanding what it means to have fire discipline. So let's not underestimate the Ottoman Turks. And there's a large debate about whether or not the machine guns at this beach. It doesn't matter a damn, to be honest. These men knew what they were doing. And there's a fire multiplication effect as they fired down into this amphitheatre. It meant that these men were held on the beach despite their best efforts. Regular troops who understood what it was like to be in this kind of situation. We can see here that we have the River Clyde in position. We can see just how difficult it was, and the difficulty of the River Clyde getting ashore, ensuring that everything was linked up with the rock spit and so on, was going to cause some major problems. It's all about the fire discipline and the capability of the Ottoman troops here, and their capability also to fill in the positions of their trenches and so on. So we can see this very famous photograph of Bahia Fort, the men coming ashore, the light is breaking away, the difficulty of getting there and sheltering away from the Ottoman fire. It must have been hellish. So if we look at these are aerial photographs that were taken later in the campaign. They're from Liman von Sander's own photograph album, by the way. And we can see here the amphitheatral form, the disputed Ottoman machine guns, and the various hills that are surrounding this, which were on that ill-fated map, by the way. We can see the difficulty that it was with the fires being poured into that amphitheatre and the enfilade that was being provided. And so it was only down to the capability of these men, these regular troops, led by a gilded staff officer, as I've been very pleased to point out to my Australian colleagues, who led this this campaign here and got to Doughty Wylie Hill and lost his life there and received the Victoria Cross, quite rightly so. So this was hard fought because the Ottomans were not only good soldiers, but also they knew their terrain. If we look to Lancashire Landing, W Beach, 6 VCs before breakfast, this very famous illustration shows the terrain absolutely perfectly. We can see here these little sand dunes. There is a cliff line behind it. And again, once again, we see the capability of these men to come ashore in the face of real difficulty with the whole enfilade fire and the challenges that was received from them. So again, you can really see it starkly from this kind of illustration. We can see here the cliffs are forming a distinct barrier. We can see how we have these sand dunes in this particular position, and we understand the capability of the Ottoman defenders. So as the Lancashire Fusiliers are coming ashore, so they're facing a kill zone. Now, I gave this lecture to West Point, to the cadets at West Point, and it was only at that point when I was giving that lecture did I realise that these were young men and women who would actually face this kind of thing in the future. It was a very, very pivotal point for me. It shows you what kind of thing these men had to face and how difficult it was to press ahead. Now, there are other beaches. So X Beach, we can see again just how difficult the terrain looks, and yet we see this obviously pathway now built in here, but how difficult it might have been to take this on as a possible landing beach. So I don't want to talk about the command and control issues which led to some of the difficulties in linking these people up, and how important the flank landings were, of course, which were very important indeed. And you know, what if, maybe, who knows? I'm of the Eric Bush Grove perspective here, in that maybe, just maybe, but I know that's not fashionable these days. So the reality here is you have something which is very much like Omaha Beach, the draws getting off from that beach, the machine gun stands, if they're there, if they're not, so what? The capability of these men to defend those beaches and holding them to that beachfront. So again, we can see how they combated that, getting into the lee of the cliffs, and also linking up with the other Royal Fusiliers at Implacable Landing in order to take the hills. But friction, in a Clausewitzian sense, had taken its toll, and this meant that these men were stuck, and they were therefore doomed to fight this trench warfare attritional battle that we've heard a little bit about from Gary this morning. So Cape Palliser terrain lessons, what we can see is narrow beaches, challenging. Underestimation of the Ottoman fire discipline, we've heard a lot about that, and I think it's right. And the overestimation of naval fire on the open glass sea, they did what they could, but naval shells were not intended to be anti-personnel. I just briefly want to talk about Anzac. This is a bad landing, a real technical term. A semi-arid landscape influenced by heavy erosion. And that's what we mostly associate our landscape, our Gallipoli with. As you can see, it's completely different to what we are seeing at Cape Helles. It's demonstrated by this painting, as we can see how significant it is. It's only at this place do we get this coming down onto the beaches, and how difficult and challenging it was. I hold, and I think it is the more informed view these days, that these men did not land in the wrong place. They landed in approximately the right place. So thanks to the Navy for that perspective. Let's look at it from this map, which is the ill-fated map that has been criticised, and I can understand why. We can see how the idea was that you would get up the ridges here, and of course they were met with very difficult terrain to actually push on. But we have got inexperienced troops, as we've heard from Gary. And of course they start to break down in terms of command and control as they are tackling that terrain. Once that starts to take place, So the frictional element of this, the capability of the uncertain actually breaking down the attack, is right there. So the campaign was lost on the beaches of Gallipoli, and I think that's also Rhys Crawley's perspective. The place that you could have landed if you really wanted to face this, of course, was that valley that went right the way across, or the low ground. But again, that is in effect a kill zone. It would have taken a lot of foresight, a lot of energy to actually invest that and to take it on. So the map itself, as you can see, is challenged because of the razor's edge. It's showing how the terrain intelligence was in some ways inadequate, in others not, because there were plenty of seaplane hours put in from the Ark Royal. But we have to remember this was the only map available to the Allies at that point. The ones that came later, well, they were captured in May, June. So we end up with a trench warfare, attritional battle, which was stuck on this tiny, tiny area, which has this slope like this approximately, where you are constantly facing the same vantage points, where you are constantly under observation, and how challenging is that going to be? So, Anzac, yes, it's largely undefended, but the rugged terrain meant that there were friction. And that friction meant the defensive was always going to be with the Ottoman troops. If you could hold them back, so it would go. So, just to sum up and finish up here, what were the challenges of terrain in 1915? I've just taken some for you. The war was widening in scope, for sure. Terrain reinforced the ability of trench warfare to operate. In Gallipoli and Flanders, the defensive positions were intelligently sighted and did their job magnificently. And breaking the siege would take a monumental feat of arms that just was not probable in 1915 with the ability that we have there. So I just want to finish with this quote from a British geographer and politician, and ask you if you have any questions. And by the way, my Twitter thingy is there at the bottom if you wish to use it. Thank you.
If you want to find the private, I know where he is. He's hanging on the old barbed wire. I saw